stained with ink, the knife, with blood. Figure 16:1, David's The Death of Marat, painted in 1793, is both a memorial to a friend and propaganda. Gloria Wilder. The light falling on Marat through the window behind him makes him seem divine, like a martyred saint. He was called one of the three gods of the French Revolution. When Robespierre unleashed the revolution's iconoclastic phase against the Catholic churches, Marat's bust was often put in place of images of Christ. In the last years of his life, when Marat wasn't sending enemies of the Republic to the guillotine, he was soaking in a tub to relieve the symptoms of a terrible skin disease he had probably contracted while hiding from royalists in the sewers of Paris. Perhaps the interminable itch helped to fuel his wrath of the people image. After Robespierre's fall and execution, David was imprisoned briefly. But he survived to change sides again. The former radical Republican became an avid Napoleon Bonaparte supporter, even after Bonaparte crowned himself emperor. David seemed to gravitate to wherever the power was. He once raved that Napoleon Bonaparte is a man to whom altars would have been raised in ancient times. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, the prince of neoclassical portraiture. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres was David's greatest student. He tried to follow in his teacher's footsteps as a history painter but couldn't cut it. He excelled at intimate, sensual close-up paintings, not sweeping documentary scenes. Ingres was a brilliant, sensitive portraitist, although his greatest works are usually considered to be his female nudes in exotic settings. When he first exhibited the Great Odalisque in 1819, critics and the public verbally attacked it. But after the initial shock, the painting grew on them. 10 years later, it was a triumph. But in the meantime, Ingres left France to study and paint in Rome, where he did portraits for a living. Business was so good that he refused to paint anyone he didn't like. Later, he moved to Florence, where he received few commissions and lived on the edge of poverty with his wife. Returning to France in 1826, Ingres discovered he was famous. Although the painting is a neoclassical masterpiece, the Great Odalisque isn't an example of classical perfection. She has mannerist proportions, her hips are too large, her neck and shoulder line too long. Her proportions were among the things viewers initially criticized. But the exaggeration is intentional, it makes the Great Odalisque seem even more luxurious and languorous. The figure's nearly classical beauty is mixed with a cool, listless sensuality that classical art never had and marks this painting as neoclassical. Ingres puts the Great Odalisque on display, invites the viewer's eyes to wander over her flesh. Yet her own eyes keep the viewer at a distance. She is a voyeur, too, watching not the viewer, but her master. The soft pillows and crumpled sheet on the couch are an invitation to pleasure, yet the slave resists in a soft-spoken way. She modestly covers her bare calf with the drape, as if she would like to cover more. She turns her body away from, and her face toward, her master. The cool blue colors of the drapes and couch, which contrast sharply with her ivory skin, emphasize her lackadaisical sexuality. Elizabeth Louise Vigée Lebrun, nice and natural. Instead of participating in or being inspired by the French Revolution, Elizabeth Louise Vigée Lebrun fled from it. She was an exceptionally talented painter, one of the few women accepted in the French Royal Academy and the personal portraitist of Marie Antoinette, whom she painted about 30 times. Female artists were expected to paint only women, children, and flowers. Most of Vigée Lebrun's paintings were of women, though she also did about 200 landscapes. But her portraits are not merely pretty, they capture the characters of her sitters. Her self-portrait with her young daughter shows the tender, close relationship between mother and child, while revealing aspects of each of their characters. The little girl, Julie, is shy, yet innocently intrigued by what she doesn't understand. Vigée Lebrun's expression is more complex. She didn't like being pregnant because it interrupted her painting. Even on the last day of her pregnancy, she'd hurry back to her canvas and continue working between contractions, which she found irritating. She seems to recall this in the portrait, and appears surprised by the delight that motherhood now gives her, despite the interruptions. The Madonna and child pose adds another level of charm, especially because this child is a girl. Vigée Lebrun's paintings are windows into the fashions of the period. She tended to dress up her models to suit her taste and usually asked them not to wear powder. She preferred to paint natural skin tones. But even when she was able to persuade the queen to shed her powder, she struggled with the queen's complexion. She noted. Figure 16-2, Vigée Lebrun's self-portrait with her daughter captures the sweet charm of an adoring mother and her daughter. Réunion de Musées Nationaux Art Resource, New York. The most remarkable thing about face was the splendor of her complexion. I never have seen one so brilliant, and brilliant is the word, for her skin was so transparent that it bore no umber in the painting. Neither could I render the real effect of it as I wished. I had no colors to paint such freshness, such delicate tints, which were hers alone, and which I had never seen in any other woman. The last painting Marie Antoinette commissioned from Vigée Lebrun was of her surrounded by her 4 children. When Louis XVI saw it, he told the artist, "I know nothing about painting, but you make me like it." The French Revolution erupted a year later. Canova and Houdon, Greek grace and neoclassical sculpture. In many cases, neoclassical statues look a lot more Greek than neoclassical paintings. Many of them, especially Canovas, have classical composure, proportions, and grace. And yet neoclassical statues look newly minted, even today. Antonio Canova, ace 18th century sculptor. Antonio Canova was the greatest neoclassical sculptor and the greatest sculptor of the 18th century. Although he was born in Venice, he developed his style in Rome, by studying and copying ancient Roman statues and reliefs. He also came under the influence of Johann Joachim Winckelmann in Rome. Canova's Roman copies were so impressive that Roman city officials offered him a long-term, well-paid job making copies. Even though he was only 20, Canova refused, saying if he always made copies, he would never learn to become a great artist in his own right. Instead, he absorbed and then expanded the ancient Greek style. For example, Canova gave the bodies of Cupid and Psyche perfect classical proportions. But their tender, passionate gestures would be out of place on the Parthenon or in a Roman temple. Romans and Greeks kept that emotional display behind closed doors, showing too much feeling was a sign of weakness or craziness. Diderot recommended that neoclassical artists use gestures, like actors on the stage, to mime moral truths. Cupid and Psyche mime a moral message: love can overcome death. Cupid revives the dying Psyche with a kiss. Jean-Antoine Houdon, in Living Stone. Jean-Antoine Houdon, like Canova, was inspired by Winckelmann and made a trip to Italy to study ancient sculpture. He specialized in sculptural portraits, which have never been surpassed. His statues are so realistic that they look like they might start delivering speeches or writing new laws. He combined a sharply observed realism with an elevated, neoclassical restraint. He made busts of many heroes of the Enlightenment, including Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, the Marquis de Lafayette, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. The sculptures preserve not only their features but also their personalities for posterity. Sometimes Houdon dressed his figures like Roman senators or consuls. He draped Voltaire, who posed for him just a few weeks before his death in 1781, in a toga. Houdon dropped the classical attire for his statue of Washington and his bust of Jefferson, which he sculpted a little later, Washington between 1785 and 1788 and Jefferson in 1789. Both Americans wear elegant period clothing, the Armani suits of the day. Their poses are presidential and enlightened. Realism mattered so much to Houdon that he hopped on a boat for the United States to do in-person studies of Washington and Jefferson. Similarly, when he heard that Rousseau had died, he rushed to his wake and made a cast of the dead man's face. Shortly after, he sculpted a lifelike bust of Rousseau from the cast. Chapter 17. Romanticism, Reaching Within and Acting Out. In this chapter, defining Romanticism, probing within. Understanding the cult of caring. Discovering what Romanticism and Revolution have in common. Tracking where Romanticism and democracy cross paths. Many art historians will tell you that Romanticism slips through your fingers when you try to define it. That's partly because Romantic artists didn't have one style like the Impressionists or Expressionists. The movement was about intense personal expression, so artists could focus on whatever turned them on. In addition, the movement wasn't grounded in France or Italy. It spread across most of Europe and later to the United States. Romanticism wasn't merely a visual arts movement, it included poetry, fiction, and music. There were even Romantic philosophers. The fact that Romanticism was so widespread and diverse makes it hard to squeeze it into one definition. In this chapter, I define Romanticism partly by telling you what it isn't, and then by exploring the art of the most important Romantics in France, England, and Germany. Kissing isn't romantic, but having a heart is. Romanticism doesn't mean lying dreamy-eyed on a patch of clover, or gazing wistfully into your lover's eyes. It doesn't refer to romance at all. It means being a staunch individualist, believing in the rights of other individuals, and expressing deep, intense, and often uplifting emotions, like Beethoven. Often, but not always, it means having a deep, spiritual relationship with nature. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her, wrote the British Romantic poet William Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey. The most famous Romantic works of art are not paintings, poems, or symphonies, but three novels, The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Miserables, both by the French writer Victor Hugo, and Frankenstein, by 18-year-old British writer Mary Shelley. All three works are outcries against man's inhumanity to man. To drive home the point, the writers magnify the inhumanity so we can see it better. They do this by directing it against outcasts, a hunchback, an ex-convict, and a man-made monster. The more of an outsider someone is, the more people abuse that person. The Romantic period was the first time in history that art focused on teaching people to care about each other. In this sense, Romanticism was art with a heart. Romantic artists were also concerned with promoting individual liberty, ending slavery, and supporting democratic and independence movements, like the Greek War for Independence from Turkey and the nationalism movement in Italy. To promote democracy in England, the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley said to his countrymen in Song to the Men of England, "Men of England, wherefore plough for the lords who lay ye low? Wherefore weave with toil and care the rich robes your tyrants wear?" The French painter Delacroix used his paintbrush to win support for the Greek struggle for independence against the Turkish Empire. His painting The Massacre at Chios broadcast the terrible price the Greeks were paying in their struggle for liberty, moving many Europeans to sympathize with the Greek cause. The British Romantic poet Lord Byron put down his pen to help out. He died in Greece from a fever in 1824. Today, Byron is a Greek national hero. Besides trying to improve social and political conditions, many Romantics went on inward quests to find and express a higher, truer reality than the one that confronts us day to day. These painters and poets became prophets of a new Romantic spirituality. In A Defense of Poetry, Shelley wrote, "The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature. A man, to be greatly good, must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of the species must become his own." Many Romantics believed that there was a basic goodness in man buried under layers of socialization. The idea was largely born in the brain of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his influential book The Social Contract, he wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau said man was naturally good and honest and that society made him bad. His social contract started a Back to Eden movement, and a lot of the Romantics got on board. Rousseau's ideas spurred the cult of the noble savage, the natural man, born in the wild and unpolluted by socialization. The noble savage was natural, good, honest, and free, just like Tarzan and Mowgli in the Jungle Book. Originally, Romantic also meant the opposite of classical. Classical is calm, orderly, even serene like the Venus de Milo. Romantic is wild, a painting or poem bursting at the seams with energy, meaning, and often intimations of something spiritual. Neoclassical artists like Jacques-Louis David and Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres felt that excessive emotion undermined the classical cool of Greek art. They preferred artwork that kept its composure, as opposed to wild, romantic paintings that seemed to muss up your hair when you looked at them. The neoclassical painter and president of the conservative London Royal Academy Sir Joshua Reynolds said, "If you mean to preserve the most perfect beauty in its most perfect state, you cannot express the passions, all of which produce distortion and deformity, more or less, in the most beautiful faces." Way Out There with William Blake and Henry Fuseli, Mythologies of the Mind. William Blake was a Romantic poet-painter. His artworks are both paintings and poems. The images help carry the poem's meaning and vice versa. Nevertheless, many people view the literature and paintings separately, but this is not what Blake intended. For him, art was a form of prayer. The paintings were the right hand in his prayer, the poetry the left. Blake also printed his work himself with an engraving method he developed and called illuminated printing. Conventional religions split body from soul, designating one evil and the other good, while the priests of the Enlightenment separated emotion from reason, viewing reason as good and emotion as bad. For Blake that was tantamount to shutting down one half of the brain to make a decision. In his complex mythology, Blake reconciled the world of the spirit and senses, and of emotion and reason. His was a personal cult of the unified and universal human being. To Blake, Sir Isaac Newton's celebrated rationalism was the epitome of half-headed thinking. So he painted a nude of Newton that shows the rationalist at war with himself. Using his rationalist's weapon, a compass, Newton divided and compartmentalized life. Figure 17:1, Blake painted Sir Isaac Newton with pen, ink, and watercolor in 1795. He made Newton resemble an ancient Greek, like Euclid or Archimedes. Tate Gallery, London Art Resource, New York. But Newton's muscular body wants to flex and burst out of the restrictions of rational thinking that Newton places on himself and nature. At the same time, Newton's body sides with his reasonable mind. It mimics the compass's triangular shape and rigidity. The right thigh, knee, and calf form a triangle, the forearm, wrist, and thumb form another triangle. The fingers form a triangle with one leg of the compass, and so on. The composition itself is divided into two roughly triangular shapes of dark and light. Blake's friend, John Henry Fuseli, liked to probe all aspects of the human psyche, too. But he seemed most comfortable with the dark side of the imagination. His painting The Nightmare appalled many British Royal Academy artists, but the public loved it. The dreaming woman's white nightgown and light skin sharply contrast with the black monsters that invade her dreams, suggesting a battle between purity and evil. But is the evil in the woman's mind or on her chest? Her body participates in the sensuality with the masked demon or incubus squatting on her chest and pawing her breast. Yet her face registers terror. The terror and title suggest that the demons are only in her mind. On the other hand, some critics believe the leering, phantasmal horse represents the artist, and the nightmare may be Fuseli's. His girlfriend rejected him and married another man about a year before Fuseli painted the first version of The Nightmare. He did for, it seems he couldn't get her or the nightmare out of his head. Fuseli used both Romanticism and symbolism to probe the darkest dungeons of the mind. Later in this chapter, I show you how Goya did the same. Inside Out, Caspar David Friedrich. The German Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich used to stand in front of a blank canvas and wait for the painting to appear in his mind. He told a fellow artist and friend, "Close your bodily eye, so that you may see your picture first with the spiritual eye. Then bring to the light of day that which you have seen in the darkness so that it may react upon others from the outside inwards." Friedrich's landscapes are visionary bridges between the internal and external. There's a dramatic tension between these worlds. But in spite of the drama, nothing ever happens in the paintings, there's no physical action. In The Wanderer Above the Mists, a lone figure takes a tentative step toward a windswept, snowy landscape that somehow seems to mirror his soul. It's as if he were about to walk into himself, his spiritual self, but he hesitates. He's attracted to the frigid landscape, but the attraction isn't powerful enough to incite him to take the fateful step. The wanderer seems to confront a spiritual frontier that is frigid and desolate as death. In Monk by the Sea, Friedrich depicts a similar theme. A lone monk stands contemplatively on a beach gazing at a night-blackened sea. A curtain of dark mist hangs ominously over the water. Like the figure in The Wanderer above the mists, the monk turns his back on the viewer to absorb and be absorbed by a sublime yet inhospitable vista. The bleak beauty attracts him and seems to foreshadow death, perhaps his own. Friedrich suffered a string of heartrending tragedies in his youth. His mother died when he was 7 years old. 6 years later, his older brother drowned trying to rescue Friedrich, who had fallen through the ice while skating. One of his sisters died of typhus 4 years after that, and another passed away a few years later. Death closed in on Friedrich at a young age, and it haunts all his art. The revolutionary French Romantics, Jericho and Delacroix. The powerful and majestic paintings of Theodore Jericho and Eugene Delacroix, two of the greatest Romantic artists, are associated with revolutionary fervor. Jericho is the father of French Romanticism, while Delacroix is its greatest practitioner. Theodore Jericho. Theodore Jericho was the first of the great French Romantic painters. He painted his most celebrated work Raft of the Medusa in 1819, when the second generation of British Romantic poets was writing its most celebrated works. Like them, he was born between 1788 and 1795, and like them, he died young. Raft of the Medusa is a kind of documentary of the aftermath of a shipwreck, with all the drama compressed into one scene. The French ship Medusa sank off the coast of Senegal on June 17, 1816. The captain and officers took the ship's 6 lifeboats for themselves and strapped together a raft made of masts for the crew and passengers. The lifeboats towed the raft for a while, but it slowed them up so much that they cut it loose. Though the raft was only 4 miles offshore, a rescue ship didn't reach it for 13 days. By that time, only 15 out of 130 men were still alive. Some had resorted to cannibalism to survive. The ship captain was a royalist of the restored Bourbon monarchy. To many French people, his neglect of the passengers seemed like a throwback to the let-them-eat-cake attitude of the pre-revolution aristocracy. Jericho's paintings seemed to incite revolution because it illustrated the heroics of the suffering lower classes in the face of aristocratic injustice and death. Although pain racks the faces and bodies of the men on the raft, Jericho mixes their agony with a muscular hope. A romantic light gilds their sprawling bodies and turns the distant sky gold. The black man on top desperately signals the far-off ship through the storm. Jericho makes him the hero. Though he comes from the lower strata of society, he has the highest place in the picture. He is the ideal romantic hero, breaking free from the chains of class to rescue his brothers. Jean Charles died a few days after being rescued. Figure 17-2, Raft of the Medusa, one of the most imposing masterpieces of French Romantic painting, is Jericho's most ambitious painting. Scala Art Resource, New York. The massive 23-foot-long painting shocked many people. Its biggest critic was the neoclassical painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Ingres demanded that the painting be taken down from the walls of the Louvre so that it wouldn't corrupt the taste of the public, which must only be conditioned to the beautiful. Art must be nothing but beauty and teach us nothing but beauty. Ingres' dislike for Jericho's masterpiece mushroomed into a general dislike for Romantic painting and triggered an art war between the neoclassicists and Romantics. After Jericho's premature death at 32, Ingres focused his attacks on Jericho's successor, Eugene Delacroix. Compare the classical composure of Ingres' The Great Odalisque and David's Oath of the Horatii with Jericho's Raft of the Medusa. David's painting expresses a rational, geometric sense of order. In the Jericho canvas, chaos reigns. The frame can't hold back the explosive energy, it spills beyond it and seems to engulf the entire world. Eugene Delacroix. 5 years after painting Raft of the Medusa, Eugene Jericho died following a riding accident. He was 32. Delacroix, who had idolized him, became the new leader of French Romanticism. Delacroix actually posed for Jericho's Raft of the Medusa. He's the dead guy lying face down front and center. Two of Delacroix's early masterpieces, Death of Sardanapalus and Liberty Leading the People, took the art world by storm and showed that a new light had dawned in European art. Figure 17-3, Delacroix. Liberty leading the people is an icon of the French spirit. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. In Liberty Leading the People, a female personification of liberty rallies the common people to fight for justice in the three-day revolution of 1830. Delacroix painted Liberty a few months after the July Revolution against the restored Bourbon monarchy. While working on it, he told his brother in a letter, "If I haven't fought for my country, at least I will paint for her." Lady Liberty in the painting makes non-French people think of a topless Joan of Arc fearlessly raising the French tricolor flag to rescue her nation from tyranny. To the French, she is Marianne, the symbol of French liberty. Although Delacroix was a well-known colorist, the tones of the painting are dull and flat, making it look like it's covered by the dust and smoke of battle. Compare the dusky colors of Liberty Leading the People to the glowing flesh tones and the rich oranges and reds in Death of Sardanapalus. But the brown hues are perfect for liberty. They're the colors of the common people. Almost all the color in the painting seems to be sucked up into the flag and the red lips of Liberty Marianne. Liberty Leading the People has become a French icon and symbol of French liberty, like the Statue of Liberty in the United States, which was a gift from the French. The painting was so inflammatory in the revolution-ridden 19th century that it was hung up and taken down more than once. It wasn't placed on permanent display in the Louvre until 1874. By then, the dust of the French revolutions had finally settled. Delacroix's Death of Sardanapalus was based loosely on the tragedy of Sardanapalus, a play by Lord Byron, whom Delacroix adored. In Delacroix's version, the Assyrian king Sardanapalus, realizing that defeat and death are imminent during a siege by the Persians, decides to massacre his attendants and concubines before the Persians do, and then commit suicide. In the play, Byron depicts Sardanapalus as a lazy, luxury-loving effeminate king whom he calls the man-queen. But the king doesn't order the slaughter of his attendants in the play, he frees them. The lusty massacre is Delacroix's invention. Romantics didn't copy, they used literary sources and historical events as launch pads for a personal vision. In the painting, Sardanapalus watches the massacre as if he were looking at a painting of it, an erotic harem scene turned into an orgy of violence. Of course, he knows he's next. Although the painting has some of the tumultuous energy of a grand Rubens canvas, the swirling symphony of intense, conflicting emotions is romantic. The women's sensuous, naked bodies emphasize their vulnerability, as well as the brutality of this merciful act of the king's. The besiegers would have presumably been even more violent. The ferocious and dynamic energy of the painting is powered by the red bedspread that flows like a river of blood from the head of the bed at the top left, where the king props himself on a pillow to watch the massacre, to the naked maiden being slaughtered at the foot of the bed on the bottom right. Delacroix's attraction to exotic, oriental themes was further fueled by a visit to North Africa and Spain in 1832. His trip influenced his brushwork and colors, too, which became more expressive and intense, as in Combat of the Giaour and the Pasha. Gradually, painting emotion took precedence over delineating precise form. Delacroix began to blur the edges between figures and their surroundings so that their emotions appear to spill from them into the atmosphere and landscape. He achieved this effect with highly energetic brushstrokes, each a transcription of pure feeling. He no longer relied entirely on composition and color to create a sense of turbulence. Now his brushwork unleashed energy, too, as in The Lion Hunt and the 1846 version of The Abduction of Rebecca. In The Abduction of Rebecca, all the colors, action, and intense emotion seem caught in a whirlwind spun by his agitated brushstrokes, which also influenced the Impressionists. The French flags. After the 1830 revolution, the tricolor flag replaced the white flag of the Bourbon dynasty as the official flag of France. It had been the French flag from 1794 until the death of Louis XVIII in 1824. But Louis's undemocratic brother and successor, Charles X, restored an absolute monarchy and replaced the tricolor flag with the traditional white flag of French kings. Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People celebrates the return of the tricolor flag, which represents the return of the liberties won during the Revolution of 1789. But the Revolution of 1830 didn't bring as much change as people had hoped. After the smoke settled, voting privileges were extended merely to the top layer of society. Only the 200,000 wealthiest male citizens could vote. France was a constitutional monarchy again. Universal male suffrage came with the next revolution, in 1848. Francisco Goya and the Grotesque. Francisco Goya, the greatest Spanish painter since Diego Velázquez, came of age during the reign of Charles III. Charles III was one of the so-called enlightened monarchs, who passed reforms to improve conditions for the common people. He also suppressed the excesses of the Spanish Inquisition. Goya grew up absorbing Enlightenment ideals that filtered from France and England into Spain. When Charles III died, his unenlightened son, Charles IV, nixed most of the reforms. Actually, Charles IV didn't nix the reforms. The nixing was simply done in his name. Charles preferred hunting to politics. His domineering queen and her lover ran the show. They also banned French books and reignited the fires of the Inquisition. Goya, by then a fully ripened liberal, attacked the new regime and the highly sensitive Inquisition with a series of 80 etchings that he called the Caprices. The etchings include images of people being tortured by the Inquisition with sarcastic captions explaining the victims' petty crimes, for having been born a Jew, for speaking a foreign language, because she was too sensitive. The most famous of the Caprices, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, shows what happens when the Enlightenment ideal of reason passes out or is suppressed. Ghoulish, big-eyed owls crouch over the image of dozing reason, while bats hover above him like winged omens of evil. In spite of the etchings, the Queen gave Goya a job as court painter the same year he published the Caprices. In 1792, Goya fell gravely ill with a fever that left him deaf for the rest of his life. The deafness isolated the artist, perhaps causing him to retreat more and more into the darker side of his imagination. When Napoleon pounced on Spain in 1808, Goya and many other liberals celebrated, believing that Napoleon's troops carried the ideals of the French Revolution in their gun barrels. To an extent, they did. Napoleon put his big brother, Joseph, on the throne. Joseph gave the Spanish a new constitution and suppressed the Inquisition's reign of terror. But soon a rumor circulated that the French were planning to kill the royal family. The rumor sparked an insurrection that the French troops brutally suppressed with their gun barrels. Goya never forgot the punitive massacres of Spanish citizens. 6 years later, after the Spanish Restoration, Goya painted 2 documentary oil paintings to commemorate the Spanish resistance during the uprising, 2nd of May, 1808 and 3rd of May, 1808. On the night of May 3, the French soldiers rounded up Spanish insurrectionists and locked them in a convent. Early the next morning, they dragged them out and executed them. The grim painting depicts the firing squad as a faceless machine of brutality, systematically massacring group after group. The frightened yet defiant victims fight back the only way they can, with their eyes. Their humanity glares down the barrels of the guns, teaching the firing squad what liberty really means. But, of course, a machine can't learn. When asked why he painted such a brutal work, Goya replied, "To warn men never to do it again." Figure 17-4, Goya's 3rd of May, 1808 confronts viewers with the brutal horrors of war and violence. Scala Art Resource, New York. In 1815, the Inquisition summoned Goya about a nude painting he'd done 18 years earlier, the nude Maya. Apparently, they'd been waiting to get at Goya. The Inquisition released him, but Goya grew bitter and lost faith in his fellow man's ability to change. Revolutions and enlightenment didn't seem to work. He retired to a country house outside Madrid in 1819. A year later, he decorated the walls with his nightmares, his so-called black paintings. The owls and bats in Sleep of Reason produces monsters had crawled out of the background of his imagination into the foreground. He no longer depicted reason as napping in his paintings, it had fled the world. J.M.W. Turner sets the skies on fire. Catastrophes inspired J.M.W. Turner. When he heard that the London Parliament was on fire, he rushed to the scene armed with his watercolors to capture the chaos on paper. He also liked to paint whipped-up seas, turbulent clouds, and fiery sunsets. Atmosphere and light were Turner's specialties, especially when riled by storms and raging winds. Academic British painters criticized him for over-dramatizing natural scenes rather than calmly capturing the solid reality of forms. Only the English critic John Ruskin truly appreciated Turner's genius. He said his paintings either evoked the poetry of silence and calmness or turbulence and wrath. Very rarely was there anything in between. Turner's painting The Slave Ship, painted in 1840, 6 years after Parliament abolished slavery in all British colonies, reveals his turbulence and wrath side. The sinking sun appears to have set the sky on fire. The sky's dazzling beauty overwhelms the viewer. The russet and black clouds on the left seem to be the smoke from this celestial fire. The sea is coppery gold. The painting's beauty draws the viewer into it. Then a gruesome reality comes into focus. Helpless hands wave at the viewer through the waves. The ship's captain ordered his crew to toss 6 slaves into the boiling sea. Now the blood-red sky, instead of being beautiful, looks like nature's reaction to the brutality. The painting was based on an article Turner read about a slave trader throwing 6 slaves into the sea so they'd be covered by his insurance policy. Slaves killed by disease weren't insured. Notice that the white light near the center looks vaguely like a radiant angel walking from the horizon onto the sea. This hint of transcendental beauty attracts the viewer to look at the painting again and again, forcing him to revisit the horrific event. The critic John Ruskin bought The Slave Ship and hung it in his house for years, until he could no longer bear the horror and took it down. Chapter 18. What you see is what you get. Realism. In this chapter, facing life without rose-colored glasses, grasping the revolutionary nature of realism, finding majesty in the mundane, interpreting Pre-Raphaelite symbolism. Keep it real is a modern expression, but not a modern idea. People have felt the need to deflate exaggeration and filter out bias since, well, probably the cave days when some braggart returned from a hunt claiming he'd bagged 50 bison by himself. In the mid-19th century, artists in France began to feel that Romanticism and Neoclassicism had stretched the truth or overlooked it. The French artists felt that the Romantics distorted reality by projecting their sublime emotions onto landscapes and people, or that they painted exotic locales instead of their own backyards. The leader of the realist movement, Gustav Kerbe, said, "I cannot paint an angel because I have never seen one." He'd never seen Babylon either and wasn't about to paint it. The realists grounded themselves in the ordinary, capturing day-to-day life on their canvases: laborers breaking up rocks, peasants hoeing a field, a baker lounging on a sack of flour. Realists also rebelled against neoclassicism and its idealized forms and subjects. They weren't about to dress farmers in togas or soften emotion, for fear of distorting the harmony of the human form. They painted straining muscles and weathered, impoverished faces, as well as pretty ones. In other words, they kept it real. On the other hand, like the Romantics, many French realists were driven by the desire to reform society, to make life fairer for the little guy, especially the peasant and factory worker. In 1848, another revolution erupted in Paris, overthrowing France's last king, Louis Philippe, the so-called Citizen King. This was a revolt of the working class. They won the revolution, got the vote, and elected a president, but working conditions stayed the same. In France, the Revolution of 1848 fired up realist painters like Gustav Kerbe, Honoré Daumier, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, and Jean-Francois Millet. They continued the fight with their paintbrushes, democratizing art by painting the poor and mixing social classes on their canvases. That was a provocative thing to do, considering that, in 1832, Daumier was thrown in prison for 6 months for a caricature of the king. The cartoon shows a gargantuan version of King Louis Philippe with a 40-foot plank extending from his open mouth like an elongated tongue. Emaciated workers load carts of materials which are wheeled up the plank, suggesting that the king stuffs himself with the produce of the working class while they starve. In this chapter, I explore works by the leading realist painters, including the Barbizon School and Hudson River School, as well as the British Pre-Raphaelites, and see how prevailing social conditions affected their work. Revolutions of 1848. The year 1848 was a year of revolutions. They detonated all across Europe in Paris, Berlin, Budapest, Vienna, Milan, Venice, and Prague. Many of the revolts occurred just a few days apart. Who lit the match that ignited all these uprisings? Europe suffered from economic depression and crop failures in the 1840s. Sparse harvests made food prices skyrocket and people starved, dreadful working conditions prevailed in factories, and socialism offered a hopeful solution with its slogan, "Workers Unite." The combination of these forces lit the first explosion and the rest went off in a chain reaction. Most of the revolutions flopped. But they set the tone for change, which progressed at a snail's pace over the next few decades. The French Revolution of 1848 was somewhat successful. All men over 21 could finally vote, and they replaced their king with an elected president, Louis Napoleon. France was a republic again. But 4 years later, Louis Napoleon overthrew his own government and became Emperor Napoleon III. Kerbe and Daumier, painting peasants and urban blight. Gustav Kerbe and Honoré Daumier were the most political of the realists. Kerbe told a newspaper after the Revolution of 1848, "I'm not only a socialist, but a Democrat and a Republican. A supporter of the whole revolution." Gustav Kerbe. In 1847, Gustav Kerbe visited Holland. The paintings of everyday people by Frans Hals, Rembrandt, and Jan Steen inspired him. Kerbe wanted to do the same kinds of paintings in France. One day, Kerbe noticed two men hacking up rocks on a dirt road. He sketched them on site and invited them to his studio to pose so he could turn his sketch into a painting. Apparently, they brought along their lunches to pose, too, a soup pot, a loaf of bread, and a spoon. Instead of romantic vistas of nature like in J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship or Casper David Friedrich's The Wanderer Above the Mists, Kerbe relegates nature, a shady hill, a patch of wheat, and a couple bushes, to the background. The focus is on hard work. Even the laborers' personalities don't matter. The young man's face turns away from the viewer, a hat hides the older man's shadowed features. They are simply generic workers. When he showed the stone breakers, Parisian society found it crude, as some people today might be turned off by a painting of a road crew drilling pavement with jackhammers. In those days, upper and middle-class people preferred to avert their eyes from the gritty side of daily life, not see paintings of it in galleries. The stone breakers reminded them of the recent working-class revolution. Harmless as it looks to us, the painting was perceived as a threat, and Kerbe probably meant it to be. In a letter to a friend, written in 1850, he said, "In our very civilized society, it is necessary for me to live the life of a savage. I must be free even of governments. The people have my sympathies. I must address myself to them directly." In addition to painting ordinary people and nature scenes, Kerbe gave his works a rough finish so they'd look grittier, like real life. No glazed veneer, no makeup, just the naked truth. Figure 18-1, Kerbe's The Stone Breakers captures on canvas the gritty side of everyday life. Photo Marburg Art Resource, New York. Official art. The governments of most European countries sponsored official Academy exhibitions throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. These exhibitions were usually the only venues in which artists could show their work. The exhibitions typically showcased art that followed the rules, not art that broke new ground. In France, the official exhibition was called the Salon of Paris and was held in the Louvre. If you couldn't get into the salon, most likely no one would see your work. At first, the exhibitions were held annually, then biannually. In 1863, the Salon rejected the work of so many artists, including famous ones, that Napoleon III established the Salon de Refuse for artists whom the Salon rejected. The Salon de Refuse was held periodically over the next 20 years. Honoré Daumier, Guts and Grit. Honoré Daumier shared Kerbe's views, but instead of painting country scenes, he focused on city life. His brand of realism tends to be expressionistic. Capturing mood and character was more important to him than detailed realism. Blurry backgrounds and heavy shadows are typical features of Daumier's work. His painting The Third-Class Carriage almost seems like a sketch. Daumier shows us the careworn faces of the poor, including that of a small boy. Years of hardship are etched on the old woman's face. The basket on her lap and her central position suggest that she is the breadwinner of this small family. Perhaps the breastfeeding mother isn't married. The background characters don't need to be sharply focused in order for the viewer to understand how they feel in this crowded, claustrophobic carriage. The brown tones, dirty yellow light and sketchy look of the painting allow you to feel the texture of poverty and travel back in time to a typical urban scene in mid-19th century France. In his lifetime, Daumier was known for his caricatures much more than his paintings. Lithography was invented just in the nick of time, 10 years before Daumier's birth. He mastered the medium and became one of France's greatest lithographers and caricaturists. Most of his caricatures mocked government officials, autocratic laws, and middle-class mores. As mentioned in the first section of this chapter, one of them got him thrown in jail for 6 months. A few years later, Daumier created a lithograph depicting the government's violent suppression of a strike. In response, the king ordered all copies of the image to be destroyed. Experimental Communism, the Paris Commune. In 1870, Napoleon III declared war on Prussia, and the Franco-Prussian War erupted. Within a year, France lost and Napoleon's government fell. For 72 days after the signing of the peace treaty, a socialist government called the Paris Commune ruled the capital. Gustav Kerbe was one of the Commune's 92 leaders. Kerbe's most remembered action as a Commune member was to recommend that the Communards knock down the Vendôme column, because it had been built to memorialize Napoleon's military victories in Italy. Kerbe said, "Inasmuch as the Vendôme column is a monument devoid of all artistic value, tending to perpetuate by its expression the ideas of war and conquest of the past imperial dynasty, which are reproved by a republican nation's sentiment. Citizen Kerbe expresses the wish that the National Defense Government will authorize him to disassemble this column." Eventually the French army besieged Paris and retook it. Thousands of communards were lined up against walls and massacred. The new government imprisoned Kerbe for 6 months and fined him 500 francs, about $100, or over $1,300 in today's dollars. While he was incarcerated, Kerbe did a chalk drawing depicting prison conditions. The drawing, called Young Communards in Prison, shows some of the young children who were imprisoned for helping the Commune. In 1873, the new Republican government of France decided to rebuild the Vendôme column destroyed by Kerbe's order. They demanded that Kerbe pay for part of it, 10,000 francs a year for 33 years. He fled to Switzerland and died the day before the first payment was due. The Barbizon School and the Great Outdoors. A year after the Revolution of 1848, the artist Jean-Francois Millet left Paris nearly broke. Millet joined another starving artist, Theodore Rousseau, in Barbizon, a tiny village about 30 miles southeast of Paris, on an edge of the forest of Fontainebleau. Together with 2 other painters, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot and Charles-François d'Aubigny, they headed the Barbizon School of Artists. They had all gone to Barbizon to paint natural scenes en plein air. Jean-François Millet, the noble peasants. Whereas Rousseau communed with nature, mesmerized by the voice of the trees, Millet painted peasants working the land. This wasn't new stuff for Millet, he'd grown up tilling the earth in rural Normandy. His love for the rustic life shows. He projected it in his landscapes like a romantic painter. A soft poetry suffuses most of his paintings. The pastoral scenes of workers sowing, harvesting, and tilling fields are so beautiful that you want to pick up a hoe and join in. But not everyone felt that way when Millet exhibited his work at the Salon of 1850. Critics attacked Millet's The Sower and the Binders and accused him of being a socialist. That sounds absurd today, but in 1850, middle and upper-class Europeans were hypersensitive about anything that had the scent of socialism. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, published 2 years earlier, in 1848, called for the overthrow of capitalism and a classless society. A painting showing peasants as equals and manual labor as ennobling and beautiful scared a lot of people. The shadowy, energetic peasant might be sowing the seeds of revolution. The gleaners, shown in the 1857 Salon, riled up Millet's critics again. For similar reasons, it seemed like he was advocating workers' rights. The painting depicts three impoverished women gleaning what's left of a wheat crop that's already been harvested. In spite of the poverty, Millet's painting dignifies the laborer's work by bathing the scene with a nostalgic light. Figure 18-2, Millet's The Gleaners documents a rural way of life that was beginning to be displaced by the Industrial Revolution. Réunion de Musées Nationaux Art Resource, New York. Despite the criticism, Millet's paintings sold and the Barbizon school's influence spread far beyond France's borders. Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, From Naked Truth to Dressed Up Reality. Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot is probably the greatest artist from the Barbizon school. The Impressionist Claude Monet said of him, "There is only one master here, Corot. We are nothing compared to him, nothing." Corot's early paintings like Chartres Cathedral and The View of Volterra were as naturalistic as Gustav Kerbe's, every object sharply defined, the background, middle and foreground distinct from one another. But around 1850, Corot changed, his paintings became poetic. He suffused them with a soft radiance, like sunlight muted by mist. These paintings appealed to and inspired Impressionists like Monet a generation later. Morning, Dance of the Nymphs is veiled with silvery summer light. The background begins in the middle ground, the two zones blending mystically together. The leaves on some of the midground trees blur and blend into the background like puffy green clouds. Even the bare-breasted nymphs frolicking in the foreground seem on the verge of dissolving into the haze. Corot has made near and far seem equally distant from the viewer, which gives the painting its poetic, almost magical power. Corot's art earned him a lot of money that he liked to share. He financed a daycare center in Paris to assist working parents. When his friend Millet died, he gave 10,000 francs to Millet's widow. He also helped Daumier, who went blind late in life. Unable to work, Daumier became homeless. Corot purchased a cottage for him. Keeping it real in America. Some Americans followed traditions developed in Europe. Others preferred homegrown styles. Realism was a natural for pragmatic Americans, especially when it celebrated majestic natural scenery or rural pleasures like boating and fishing or paintings of the sea. Westward Ho! With Albert Bierstadt. Albert Bierstadt was born in Solingen, Germany, grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, returned to Germany for 4 years to study painting, and came back to the United States to paint. Bierstadt's specialty was spectacular mountain scenery. He made sketches and took photos of the scene, often in treacherous and dangerous locations. From these photos, he painted his awe-inspiring landscapes. For example, he headed west with an expeditionary party in 1859 and, in the summer of 1861, sketched in eastern Shoshone country in the Wind River region of Wyoming. In the Rocky Mountains, Landers Peak, he works the natural sunlight to highlight pieces of the landscape as if he were shining spotlights on them. Although Native Americans and animals populate the foreground and middle ground of the painting, they don't project any personality, they're simply local color and ambience. It's the light in the painting that has personality. Bierstadt always went for the long, wide shot, so to speak, and never the intimate close-up. Navigating sun, storm, and sea with Winslow Homer. The earliest paintings of Winslow Homer are of the Civil War, which he covered as a pictorial reporter for Harper's Weekly in 1862. After the war, he studied in Paris for a year, but it doesn't appear that he absorbed much from the French Impressionist movement, which was coming into its own at that time. In fact, after he returned to the United States, Homer painted mostly realistic scenes of happy rural life, many of them of pastoral figures in sun-drenched landscapes. He began experimenting with watercolors and soon mastered the medium to become one of the greatest watercolor artists in history. Homer's best paintings are watercolor seascapes done primarily in the 1880s in Maine. Man against nature is the main theme that runs through most of his sea paintings. In Homer's Summer Night, silhouetted figures ensconced on black rocks gaze at a glassy sea. Two women in evening gowns, one with a wistful expression, dance solemnly on the shore as if to the music of the crashing waves, but the other figures take no notice of them. The glorious scene entrances them. Boating Through America with Thomas Eakins. Like Winslow Homer, Thomas Eakins studied in Paris in the 1860s. But he stayed much longer than Homer and appears to have absorbed more art styles. His most famous paintings are of boat racers. In the Biglan Brothers racing, he captures a sense of cinematic action. You feel the effort of the rowers, yet the scene is peaceful. The tension between rowing and the surrounding serenity of nature gives the painting its power and interest. But Eakins was more than a boat painter. He was a very versatile master of many genres. His Agnew Clinic, a painting of a surgical operation performed on a woman before an auditorium of medical students, is a probing study of character. He examines the personalities of the medical students as carefully as the surgeons examine the body on the operating table. Let There Be Light, the Hudson River School. Luminous light was the hallmark of the Hudson River School artists, a loosely linked group that included Bierstadt, Frederick Edwin Church, Martin Johnson Head, and others. Focusing on the Hudson River Valley and the mountain ranges in New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire, their goal was to glorify American scenery and life. Their romanticized landscapes imply that man and nature live in perfect harmony. The Hudson River School didn't usually paint en plein air, but in studios where they could dress up their paintings to reflect an idealized vision of the United States. The Pre-Raphaelite. Brotherhood, Medieval Visions and Painting Literature. 3 British art students, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millet, and William Holman Hunt, launched the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848. In school, they avoided the splashy techniques and stylized subjects of Royal Academy of Arts instructors. The Pre-Raphaelites chose their name out of respect for the perfect naturalism of Raphael, and as a reminder of how all of Raphael's followers got art wrong by making it too stylized and artificial. Like the French realists, they chose to paint nature as she is, with an almost photographic realism. Yet the Pre-Raphaelites weren't realists. They didn't paint peasants working in the fields. Or England's urban poor. They looked to medieval art and literature for models. They painted fictional rather than true stories drawn from medieval romances, Dante Alighieri, William Shakespeare, Alfred Tennyson, and Romantic poets. The Pre-Raphaelites were particularly fond of Arthurian romances. They also painted pictures with stained glass. Like the French realists, the Pre-Raphaelites hoped to reform society. They rejected middle-class materialism and were opposed to mass production because it turned workers into robots and churned out functional products without aesthetic value. They also objected to middle-class art buyers. In England, the middle class bought art that reflected their values and glorified the Industrial Revolution that had leveraged their social rise. They had a tendency to buy art that looked like the Industrial Revolution, preferring murky colors and brown tints that made the paintings look as though they'd been colored by the breath of London's textile factories. To counter this penchant for brown, the Pre-Raphaelites used dazzling colors that had just been invented. To intensify these colors even more, they first painted their canvases with a bright white layer. This makes the colors stand up and shout, "I'm red, I'm blue." Dante Gabriel Rossetti, leader of the Pre-Raphaelites. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the leader of the Pre-Raphaelites, was both a poet and a painter. He sometimes wrote poems to accompany his paintings, which he called double works. The often brilliant poems elaborate on the painting's meanings. Rossetti was the most mystical member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. His Beata Beatrix follows the poet Dante's muse Beatrice to heaven. Rossetti's own wife, Elizabeth Siddal, had died, possibly by committing suicide, the same year. Rossetti links her to Beatrice in the painting. With closed eyes, Beatrice Elizabeth peers across the gulf of death and sees a faded Dante Rossetti trying to reach her from the other world. A gilded sundial next to Beatrice Elizabeth's shoulder marks both terrestrial time and the hours of eternity. A haloed bird sets a poppy on Beatrice Elizabeth's lap, a symbol of remembrance. In this case, it's more than a symbol. Elizabeth Siddal overdosed on laudanum, a poppy derivative. The Pre-Raphaelites tried to embed symbols naturalistically into their paintings instead of superimposing them. In this way, Beata Beatrix could be both naturalistic and symbolic. For a mystic like Rossetti, this was hard to do. The more grounded Millet was better at achieving a natural-looking symbolism in his paintings. John Everett Millet and soft-spoken symbolism. In his painting Christ in the House of His Parents, John Everett Millet depicts Jesus at the age of 8 or 9 in his father's carpenter shop. Millet embeds naturalistic symbols of Christ's crucifixion in the scene. The nails on the table are something you'd find on a carpenter's bench, but they also suggest the crucifixion. Joseph holds a spike right next to Jesus's open hand, suggesting that Jesus accepts his fate, even as a child. The young John the Baptist, on the right, carries a bowl of liquid, while eyeing Jesus. A dove perches on a ladder, symbolizing the Holy Spirit descending from heaven, and a flock of sheep peek in the room as if looking for their shepherd. All the symbols fit naturalistically into the scene. The painting offers both the realism of a snapshot and the symbolism of poetry. Millet's most famous painting is Ophelia. In this work Millet depicts the suicide of Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet, described by Hamlet's mother Gertrude. There is a willow grows aslant the brook, that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream, there with fantastic garlands did she make of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There on the pendant boughs her coronet weeds clamoring to hang, an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook. Her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old lauds, but long it could not be till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Millet captures the scene with great poetic power, combining botanical realism with a brutally beautiful depiction of a suicide provoked by what Ophelia wrongly believed was unrequited love. Ophelia accepts death with upturned hands as she sinks into an environment with which she perfectly harmonizes. Her open mouth, half-shut eyes, and already deathly pale skin enhance the poignancy of Millet's painting. To paint Ophelia, Millet had his model lie in a bathtub for hours during the winter. He heated the tub by placing lamps under it. But one day the lamps burned out. He was too absorbed in his work to notice. But Siddle never complained. She nearly died afterward and never recovered completely. The arts and crafts movement adding form to function. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which expanded to 7 members, broke up after a couple years. After the dissolution of the group, one of the members, William Morris, launched the highly influential arts and crafts movement. Morris's goal was to replace generic, mass-produced items like furniture with beautiful, handcrafted objects. Why did a chair have to be merely functional? Couldn't it be beautiful, too? Morris hoped his handcrafted products industry would grow large enough to provide creative alternative employment opportunities for factory workers. He also hoped the products would be as affordable as mass-produced commodities. However, Morris proved a better craftsman than an economist. His arts and crafts movement never panned out financially, remaining a luxury for the rich while the masses embraced machined furniture made cheaply in large factories. However, his totalizing approach to interior design, taking a hand in crafting everything from the curtains to the light fixtures to the tea set, inspired many artists and architects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chapter 19. First Impressions, Impressionism. In this chapter, breaking up light. Catching up with the high-speed brushstroke, examining the evolution of Impressionism.
Paintings by Monet, Renoir, and Degas brighten people's homes, dress up their offices, cheer them in hospitals, and inspire vacations to France. Postcard copies of their paintings occasionally greet people in their mailboxes. You can even find Renoir wrapping paper and Degas paper plates. Impressionism is the most popular art movement of all time. Collectors will pay $50 million to own an original Monet or Renoir, yet when their paintings first came on the market in 1874, most people wouldn't pay $10 for one. Why is Impressionism such a hit more than a century after the style exhausted itself in France? partly because Impressionism's rapid stroke, feathery style, and bright as spring colors make most of the paintings as refreshing and invigorating as a pleasant May day. Entering an Impressionist gallery in a museum is like walking into an eternal spring. Despite all these positives, the term Impressionist was originally intended as an insult. It meant that the paintings looked unfinished and that the artists were too lazy to refine their brush strokes. Colors dissolve into each other in Impressionist art, and images blur a bit like an action shot in photography. But there's a point to the soft focus. Impressionist artists were interested in the interplay of colors and light more than the precise contours of people and things. They wanted to capture the fleeting quality of life, impressions, glances, gestures, a pleasant stroll in the sun. The soft focus gives people the sense of a lovely impression caught before it slips away. As the heirs of realists like Gustav Kerbe and Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, most Impressionists preferred to paint from real life and plein air. The invention of the tin paint tube in 1841 made oil paint available to artists in easy-to-use tubes, which made outdoor painting more convenient. To capture fleeting moments on canvas, the Impressionists had to paint fast and use loose or sketchy brush strokes. They needed to make each dab of paint work double time and suggest more than it portrayed. They succeeded. You can practically feel the sunlight radiating from their canvases and the breezes whispering through the scenery. Often, people see Impressionist works as merely pretty, but early paintings by Manet and some other Impressionists had shock value, both in how they were painted and what they occasionally portrayed. Manet and Degas painted numerous images of people who seemed to be alienated and depressed by the so-called progress of capitalism. Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro, on the other hand, were more interested in capturing beautiful moments and in the changing effects of light on landscapes than in reforming society. All of them were children during the Revolution of 1848. During the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune, Monet and Pissarro fled to England. Degas joined the National Guard, and Renoir served in the 10th Cavalry Regiment of the French Army. If they had a message, it was that life is beautiful, every fleeting second of it. In this chapter, I examine the art and painting techniques of the greatest Impressionist painters, Édouard Manet, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Mary Cassatt, and Berthe Morisot. M&M, Manet and Monet. Impressionism began to take shape in the 1860s on the canvases of Édouard Manet, Claude Monet, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir. But the actual birth, if a delivery date can be pinpointed, was probably the summer of 1869 when Monet and Renoir painted views of a swimming resort at La Grenouillère on the Seine. That summer, they learned to catch the transitory moods of nature with quick, suggestive brush strokes. It was here that the broken brushstroke style became a standard characteristic of Impressionist art. The movement didn't yet have a name. That came 5 years later when a critic attacked one of Monet's early paintings, Impression, Sunrise. Monet and Renoir pioneered this new art style by borrowing and adapting techniques that Manet had developed a few years earlier. In the following sections, I fill you in on Manet and Monet. I cover Renoir later in this chapter. Édouard Manet, breaking rules to free the artist. The classically trained Édouard Manet straddled realism and Impressionism. He influenced the Impressionists and was, in turn, influenced by them. In the 1860s, the Impressionists began meeting near Manet's studio at Café Gerbois. He was the unofficial head of the twice-weekly meetings, which included Monet, Renoir, Degas, Alfred Sisley, Émile Zola, and sometimes Paul Cézanne, Camille Pissarro, and others. What was the bridge between realism and Impressionism? It was Manet's new approach to painting, his innovations with color and brushwork. Earlier artists began painting their canvases with a layer of dark, usually brown, paint and then built layers of paint on top of it. Of course, they had to wait for each layer to dry before adding the next one. Finally, they glazed the painting to give the surface a smooth finish. This process could take weeks or months. The advantage of painting in layers is that you can home in on the right color, gradually refining, layer after layer, until it's perfect. Obviously, The models couldn't pose all that time. So painters frequently added layers without the model being present. As a realist, Manet preferred to paint from life, in other words with his model in front of him. He did this by completing his paintings in one sitting. How did he achieve this high-speed efficiency? By not painting in layers and not glazing the final product. That meant he had to choose the perfect color right off the bat because there were no layers to fall back on. His first draft was his final draft. There was no opportunity for editing, at least in theory. However, radiographs of his paintings show that he did do some editing. When he made a mistake, he scraped off the paint, down to the bare canvas, and then repainted that area. The Impressionists, most of whom worked outdoors from life, adopted Manet's alla prima technique. Without it, they couldn't have painted fast enough to capture the shifting effects of light. Manet didn't invent alla prima painting. Many of the old masters, such as Matthias Grunewald, Caravaggio, and Frans Hals, used it in conjunction with other techniques. Manet's innovation was to use it exclusively, eliminating the need for the slow buildup of layers of paint. Manet also painted in patches of color, cutting out in between values to make sharper contrasts. So instead of painting a range of progressively lighter or darker shades of orange to indicate how close an orange dress is to a light source, he would simply slap on a patch of bright orange. This technique is called Techism. This spotting technique made Manet's paintings look flat. The leading French realist, Kerbe, said that Manet's paintings are as flat as playing cards. This flatness gives his art an in-your-face immediacy. The Impressionists modified this technique by breaking up Manet's color patches into much tinier patches, flecks, and dabs of color. Compare the skin of Manet's Olympia in Figure 19-1 to the finely graded skin tones of Vermeer's Girl with a pearly ring in the color section. Figure 19-1, Manet's Olympia is a mid-19th century example of shock art. René de Musées National Art Resource, New York. Manet was a great innovator. Even when he painted conventional subjects, like a picnic or a female nude, he did it unconventionally. The Impressionists appreciated his fresh approach. The public didn't. Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which depicts a midday picnic with two conservatively dressed men sitting beside a stark naked woman, outraged and alienated the public. Although there's no erotic behavior, the woman's casual, public nudity shocked people. One critic called it a shameful, open sore. Critics also attacked Manet's brushwork, his color patch technique. The Salon of 1863 rejected the painting, but it was included in the Salon des Refusés exhibition, held the same year for works that the Salon rejected. The Salon of 1865 accepted Manet's Olympia, which caused an even bigger scandal than Luncheon on the Grass. Manet obviously intended the painting to shock. Everything about it is a radical break from the norms of European art. He chose to call the painting Olympia because it resembles the names adopted by Parisian brothel prostitutes who liked to use exotic pseudonyms. Concubines had been painted elegantly before. Jean-Auguste Dominique engrazes the Great Odalisque as an example, but Manet's painting made people feel as though they'd been dragged into a brothel. It was as if a prostitute were advertising herself on his canvas. The painting was too real. But there's much more to Olympia than that. When Manet was 20, he visited Florence and copied Titian's masterpiece The Venus of Urbino. Olympia pays homage to Titian's painting and serves as a potent parody of it. Titian's nude is curvaceous, soft, and sensual. Olympia is angular, naked rather than nude, and she has her shoes on. In The Venus of Urbino, a cuddly dog curls up beside the goddess. Instead of a dog, Manet paints a black cat with an erect tail on the edge of Olympia's bed. Whereas Venus's face is alluring and tender, Olympia looks like a naked businesswoman. Titian shows off the Renaissance rediscovery of perspective in his work. Manet's painting is intentionally flat, which puts Olympia even closer to the viewer, like a window display. Claude Monet, From Patches to Flecks. The new style of Claude Monet came from a shift in focus. He looked at the colors of objects instead of the objects themselves. He advised another painter. When you go out to paint, Try to forget what objects you have before you, a tree, a house, a field. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here an oblong of pink, here a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape. He believed that people should always judge based on first impressions, before getting to know something or someone. Becoming familiar with an object or a face falsifies it. You get the gist of what you see, a blue car, a red house, or a man's double chin, so your eyes don't search out details. You settle for an approximation. But the first time you encounter a face or place, you examine it thoroughly. Ah, her eyes are green with flecks of blue. The window has a Z-shaped crack in it. To notice the color components of an object, Monet had to stop seeing the object and focus on the color. In the second half of his long career, Monet painted series of the same scene captured at different times of day. Some of these paintings are like pictorial clocks, especially the haystack series. You can tell the time by the light and shadow on the hay bundles. Most of the Impressionists bypassed the juried Salon exhibitions and held their own unjuried exhibitions, which gradually eroded the Salon's control of taste. The first independent exhibition was in 1874. Among other works, Monet showed Impression, Sunrise. The name inspired one critic to condemn all the paintings in the show for being impressionistic or incomplete. Although it was intended as an insult, most of the artists liked the label, so it stuck. Monet invented a new style of painting based on capturing the subtleties of color and light rather than perfect lines and shapes, color over contour. He experimented with effects of light and atmosphere throughout his career. Often, he painted slashes of contrasting colors like red and green side by side, without in-between values. This causes your eye to bounce rapidly from color to color, giving his paintings their shimmering effect. Springtime is a painting of Monet's wife Camille reading a book in a meadow. Camille's softened beauty blends gently with the landscape so that she seems to be one with her surroundings. Other than that, the painting has no obvious symbolism or message. But it leaves a lasting poetic impression, which may be more enduring than any message. The painting is simply a lovely moment captured on canvas before it fades forever. Camille died at the age of 32, 7 years after Monet painted Springtime. In Springtime, Camille is reminiscent of Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers. The dappled sun on her dress resembles the smudges of white flowers beside her, connecting her to the landscape like a goddess of nature. In any case, she creates an otherworldly impression and seems to float on the feathery lawn like a sun-streaked cloud. If you focus closely on the lawn, you can see how color was more important than shape to Monet. One brush stroke signifies a clump of grass. He painted the color of an area of grass, not the shapes of individual grass blades or grass clumps. Look closely at how Monet constructs Camille's dress and bonnet from masses of pinks, grays, and white that merge into the flowing shape of the fabric. You may suspect that Monet drifted from his ideal of ignoring the object and focusing on its colors while painting Camille's face. Compare the flurry of brush strokes in the upper right quarter of Springtime with the brushwork on his wife's face. Up close, the frenzied strokes of the upper right quadrant looked like a whirlwind of leaves,